The night air hangs heavy over the crumbling structure, as if the asylum itself is holding its breath. Its windows, shattered long ago, gape like hollow eyes, staring blankly into the moonlight. Time has stripped away its grandeur. Ivy claws across the walls, bricks crumble into dust, and yet in the stillness stood as the final beacon of hope against the hungry void of the ocean. Yet, for all its symbolism of safety, the lighthouse could also become something else entirely: a prison, a tomb, and in some tales, a doorway to the other side. Imagine it a solitary tower clawing into the sky, lashed by relentless storms. The wind howls like a beast in pain, rain lashes against stone, and waves slam against the rocks below with bone-shattering force. In that lonely lantern room, a single man tends the flame. He keeps the light alive not just for the ships beyond, but for his own sanity. He writes in his logbook with hands trembling from exhaustion. He marks the passing days with lines that blur together, and he whispers into the darkness, though no one is there to listen. This is where our story begins, not with ships or storms but with silence. A silence that stretches so long, it begins to carve into the mind of the one left to keep the flame burning. For the tale you are about to hear is not simply about a man's duty or the dangers of the sea. It is about a keeper who refused to leave his post. A man who, according to legend, was swallowed by the very tower he vowed to serve, condemned to an eternal watch that continues even after death. History is littered with strange accounts of lighthouses, keepers who vanished without a trace, lights extinguished during the blackest of nights, wrecks that happened under mysterious circumstances. Every culture with a coastline has its own stories of cursed beacons and haunted towers. But one tale stands apart, a tale whispered along jagged coasts, repeated in fishing villages, and carried like salt in the air. They say the lighthouse itself claimed him, binding his soul to its stones. Sailors have always been a superstitious breed. They see omens in the flight of gulls, hear warnings in the crash of waves, and whisper prayers to the sea as though it were alive. To them, a lighthouse is not just a structure, it is a living presence, a guardian or a jailer. And what happens when the guardian refuses to leave? What happens when a man's devotion becomes obsession, when duty becomes something darker, an anchor that drags him down into the abyss of madness and beyond? Our keeper was not the first man to be swallowed by the weight of solitude, nor was he the last. Yet his tale has endured for one reason: no matter how many decades pass, no matter how much the shoreline changes, there are those who swear the light in his tower has never gone out. Mariners claim they see it flicker in the storm, even when official records show the lighthouse was decommissioned. Travelers speak of a figure pacing the lantern room, hands clasped behind his back, his face hidden in shadow, and when locals are pressed about the story, they fall quiet, their eyes darting toward the sea, as if the waves themselves are listening. It is said that during the great storm of his final days, the waves swallowed ships whole, and the rocks below his tower became a graveyard of splintered wood and drowned men. Some believed he had betrayed his oath, that instead of guiding ships to safety, he had guided them to their doom. Others believed the sea had grown jealous of his devotion, dragging him into its cold depths and leaving his spirit behind, chained to the light he loved too much to abandon. But here lies the heart of the mystery. No one knows for certain what became of him. The official records are thin, scattered with contradictions. His death certificate exists in some archives, yet no body was ever recovered. His name was written into history, but his presence has never left the tower. Those who dare to visit speak of footsteps echoing in empty stairwells, of lanterns swinging in rooms without wind, of whispers carried down the spiral staircase like a voice drifting from the deep. The story of the lighthouse keeper who never left is not just a ghost story, it is a warning. It is about the cost of obsession, the prison of solitude, and the thin veil that separates the living from the dead. Tonight we descend into that story. We will walk the cold stone floors of the tower, hear the roar of the storm that sealed his fate, and uncover the chilling truth that binds his name to one of the darkest legends of the sea. The light still burns, but whether it is a beacon of salvation or a lure into darkness depends on who is watching from the shore. Long before satellites tracked storms and radar mapped coastlines, the ocean was a vast and merciless expanse. For centuries, sailors had only the stars, crude maps, and instinct to guide them, but the sea has no mercy for mistakes. A single miscalculation, a single moment of blindness in fog or storm, could send a ship smashing against jagged rocks, dragging hundreds of men into watery graves. It was here, in the unrelenting war between man and sea, that the lighthouse emerged as both savior and sentinel. The earliest lighthouses were not towers of stone but great bonfires built on cliffsides. Flames roared into the night, their smoke curling above black waters like ghostly fingers. These primitive beacons were as much spiritual offerings as navigational aids. Fire meant life, and to sailors, a flicker of light on the horizon was the difference between salvation and certain death. Over centuries, fires evolved into structures, stone towers, lanterns, mirrors, and later mighty Fresnel lenses that could send a blade of light cutting across the ocean for miles. With every innovation, humanity pushed back against the chaos of the deep. By the 18th and 19th centuries, lighthouses had become symbols of empire and endurance. Nations raced to build taller, stronger towers along their coastlines. Britain dotted its cliffs with sentinels to guard merchant ships. America's eastern seaboard glittered with lights warning of reefs and shoals. France pioneered lenses so powerful they turned a dim flame into a piercing sun. Each new structure was more ambitious than the last, defying storms, earthquakes, and time itself. The lighthouse was not merely a building, it was a declaration that man could tame the edge of the abyss, but such triumph came at a cost. For the beams to shine, someone had to keep them alive. The role of the lighthouse keeper was a sacred one, and yet it demanded more than most men could endure. Imagine a life of relentless repetition, climbing narrow staircases night after night, trimming wicks, refilling oil, polishing brass, and wiping salt from glass as storms battered the tower. Hours stretched into days, days into years, until time itself seemed to dissolve into the steady rotation of the lantern above. To be a keeper was to live in exile, not just from society, but often from one's own family. Isolation was the silent predator. Remote lighthouses were built on rocky islets or cliffs, where supply boats came only once a month, sometimes less in winter. Letters from home took weeks to arrive. Birthdays, funerals, wars, revolutions, all of it passed beyond the horizon, while the keeper remained tethered to his post. Some embraced the solitude, describing it as a spiritual calling. Others broke beneath it, their minds fracturing under the endless drone of the sea. Whispers of madness began to cling to lighthouse keepers' tales. Journals tell of men speaking to shadows, of phantom knocks on iron doors, of keepers burying their partners on the island and continuing their watch as though nothing had happened. Some stories speak of entire crews vanishing, leaving meals untouched, lanterns lit, and doors bolted from the inside. To the outside world, lighthouses were bastions of safety, but inside their walls they could be chambers of madness. Maritime folklore only fed these fears. Sailors spoke of ghost lights that lured ships to destruction, of phantom beacons appearing on cliffs where no tower had been built. Legends told of drowned keepers who returned to tend the light even after death, bound by their oath. To many, lighthouses were liminal spaces, caught between the living and the dead, between sea and sky, between salvation and damnation. This was the age of lighthouses, an era where progress and superstition walked hand in hand. The towers stood as engineering marvels, yet their keepers became myths in flesh. They were admired for their discipline, pitied for their loneliness, and feared for the strange stories that swirled around them like fog. Even governments recognized the toll. Manuals for lighthouse service spoke not only of technical duties, but of moral and spiritual strength, warning recruits that the work was not for the faint of heart. The sea, of course, cared for none of this. Storms came without warning, and many towers were destroyed in tempests or swallowed by shifting sands, whole crews drowned trying to reach their posts. To the ocean, the lighthouse was just another structure to be tested, beaten and sometimes claimed, and in these relentless clashes, legends were born of towers that withstood the impossible and of keepers who never returned. It is within this wider history that our story of the man who never left takes root. He was not the first keeper to dedicate his life to the lantern, nor the first to blur the line between duty and obsession. But his tale is unique in its endurance, passed down not just as a footnote in maritime history, but as a haunting reminder of the human cost behind the light. For every beacon that glimmered across the waves, there was a soul bound to it, living in silence so others could live in safety. And sometimes, that silence grew too heavy. Sometimes the keeper did not leave when his duty ended. Sometimes the light was kept burning by more than human hands. This is the age that birthed the legend of the keeper, who never left his tower. A world where lighthouses stood as both saviors and prisons, and where one man's devotion would transcend the boundary of life itself. To understand the man who never left his tower, one must first understand the weight of the oath he carried. Being a lighthouse keeper was not a mere profession, it was a vow, a lifelong binding to the light and the lives it protected. When a keeper accepted his post, he accepted more than the isolation of the sea. He accepted that his every waking moment belonged not to himself, but to the flame that cut through darkness. The lantern was not simply a machine of glass and steel, it was an eternal responsibility. The oath began with duty. A keeper was sworn to ensure that the light never failed. Storm or calm, war or peace, sickness or health, it mattered not. If the flame went out, ships would die, and blood would be on his hands. This unrelenting expectation created men who were both revered and feared, for they carried a burden that was nearly impossible to be perfect, night after night, with no room for error. Their failures were counted in corpses dashed against rocks. Their successes, invisible, were carried silently in the holds of ships that reached harbor safely. Training manuals from the 19th century were written like scripture. They described the keeper's responsibilities in language that bordered on religious text. The keeper shall keep the light from sunset to sunrise without fail, for the preservation of human life. The phrasing was deliberate. To tend a lighthouse was to engage in a ritual of salvation. Each evening the keeper climbed the spiral staircase, checked the oil, polished the glass, and lit the lantern. Each dawn he extinguished the flame, cleaned the soot, and recorded the night's observations. It was worship disguised as work, and the lantern room was a kind of altar, but duty alone was not enough. The oath demanded sacrifice. Keepers were warned that their families might suffer. A posting at a remote station often meant months of separation from wives and children. Many keepers buried their loved ones ashore while they remained chained to their post, their grief recorded only in logbooks stained with tears. Some keepers did not marry at all, choosing instead a life entirely devoted to the sea. They gave up warmth for cold stone walls, laughter for the howl of storms, and human touch for the endless company of crashing waves. Discipline was enforced with military severity. A keeper could be dismissed for the smallest infraction: an unpolished lens, an untrimmed wick, a logbook left incomplete. Inspectors would arrive unannounced, combing through records and testing the light. If the flame faltered, punishment was swift. The oath allowed no weakness, no lapse of attention, for to fail the tower was to betray not only one's post, but one's very identity as a keeper. Over time this oath blurred into obsession. Many keepers came to see themselves not just as servants of the lighthouse, but as part of it. They spoke of the tower as if it were alive, a stern but demanding companion. In private letters, some even described dreams where the lighthouse spoke to them, urging them to remain vigilant, warning them of catastrophe should they falter. Whether these dreams were born of loneliness or something more otherworldly remains uncertain, but for those who lived within the lighthouse walls, the line between reality and ritual grew thin. For the man at the center of our story, the oath became his entire existence. He was not the first to serve in his tower, nor the last, but he treated the light as though it were his soul. Each evening he performed the ritual with near religious precision, cleaning, polishing, lighting, recording. He would whisper words as though in prayer, standing before the great glass lens like a monk before a relic. To him the oath was not a line in a manual, it was a covenant that could not be broken, not even by time, not even by death. And yet, hidden within this devotion was danger. The oath that was meant to protect life could also consume it. Keepers who bound themselves too tightly to the light began to lose themselves. Their identity dissolved until they were no longer men, but extensions of the tower itself. The outside world, families, villages, the passage of seasons faded into irrelevance. Only the light remained. The oath became a chain, and many who carried it bore the marks of its weight: weary eyes, hollow cheeks, and a silence that clung to them like damp fog. Those who lived near the coasts noticed this transformation. They whispered that keepers were not like other men. Some said they aged faster, worn down by the sea. Others claimed they aged slower, as if the light fed on them, keeping them alive only to serve longer. To fishermen and sailors, keepers were both respected and pitied. They were guardians, yes, but also prisoners of their own devotion. This is what makes our tale so haunting. For the keeper who never left, the oath did not end with his final watch. Where others eventually passed their duties to a successor, he refused. Where others walked down the spiral staircase one last time, he climbed back up again and again, even as the years turned and the sea called his name. His covenant with the light endured beyond the limits of flesh. He had given his soul to the tower, and the tower had accepted. The oath was never meant to be broken, and in his case it never was. There are lighthouses that rise near bustling harbors, their beams sweeping across waters filled with ships and trade, and there are lighthouses built in exile, isolated, battered by storms, forgotten by time. The lighthouse at the heart of this story belongs to the second kind. It stood not as a monument of progress, but as a sentinel on the edge of the world, a place where the sea swallowed the horizon, and where the line between survival and death was drawn by a single light. The land it guarded was no welcoming coast. Jagged black rocks erupted from the surf like the teeth of a drowned giant, their edges sharp enough to tear a wooden hull to splinters in seconds. The sea crashed against them with relentless fury, sending columns of spray higher than the tower's gallery. In storms the sound was deafening, an endless roar like cannon fire, echoing across cliffs. Fishermen avoided the area, unless necessity forced them there, and even then they rowed quickly, muttering prayers to ward off the spirits they swore haunted the waters. The tower itself was an engineering marvel, though it looked less like human triumph, and more like a fortress built against God's wrath. Rising from its rocky pedestal, it was made of thick stone blocks, quarried miles inland and ferried across treacherous seas to be stacked with painstaking precision. Every stone carried the weight of lives lost to storms, every joint sealed with the knowledge that failure meant catastrophe. When the lighthouse was finished, it loomed like a pillar of judgment, its lantern crowned with a lens capable of piercing through the thickest fog. But if its architecture inspired awe, its location inspired dread. Supplies could only be delivered when weather allowed, which meant weeks could pass without the arrival of fresh food or news from the mainland. Winter storms could isolate the tower for months, turning the keepers into prisoners. Its spiral staircase, coiling endlessly upward, became both a lifeline and a curse, carrying men from the base's cramped quarters to the lantern room, where duty weighed heavier with each step. The higher they climbed, the further they drifted from the world of the living. Locals called it the tower by the edge of the world. It was a name whispered with a mixture of awe and fear. They said the land itself resisted intrusion, that no man could stay long without losing part of himself to the wind and the waves. Stories told of ancient wrecks long before the tower was built, of ghost ships appearing in the mist, of cries that drifted across the water with no source. To the villagers, the lighthouse was necessary, but it was also cursed, a structure built not only to guide ships but to keep something contained. Inside, the atmosphere was no less oppressive. The walls sweated with salt, the air carried the constant tang of oil and brine, and every sound echoed endlessly through the stone. At night, the howl of the storm outside mixed with the creak of metal fittings, the drip of condensation, the rattle of shutters. Even in calm weather the silence was unbearable, broken only by the distant moan of the sea. Keepers slept lightly, always half listening for the bell of disaster, always half dreaming of the waters below. And then there was the lantern room itself, the heart of the tower, encased in glass. The lens rotated with slow hypnotic rhythm, throwing out its brilliant beam across the void. To a sailor lost at sea, it was salvation. To the keeper, It was a merciless god demanding endless devotion. Night after night, he stood before it, trimming the wick, polishing the lens, shielding the flame from the breath of the storm. The light cycle became the rhythm of his life. He no longer measured time in days, but in rotations of the lens. It is said that the keeper of our tale grew especially bound to this place. He would walk the gallery in storms, letting the rain lash against his face, as if to prove himself against the fury of the sea. He would stand by the rail, staring into the black waters as though waiting for something to rise from the depths. Neighbors on the mainland said they could see him pacing even from miles away, a lone silhouette moving back and forth against the glow of the lantern. To them, he was less a man than a shadow fused into the stone of the tower. Whispers grew around the village. Some said he was not merely devoted, but possessed, claimed by the lighthouse itself. Others suggested he had made a bargain, that his unwavering service was the price of survival, not for him but for the ships and souls that passed through the waters. Whatever the truth, the tower became inseparable from his name, and his name inseparable from the tower. Visitors who braved the journey spoke of an oppressive energy within its walls. Some described the unsettling feeling of being watched, even when the keeper was nowhere to be seen. Others claimed the very stones seemed to hum, as though storing centuries of suffering. One sailor, having stayed a single night, refused ever to return, declaring that the lighthouse looked outward with its beam, but inward it was filled with eyes. In time, the setting itself became as important to the legend as the keeper. The rocks, the waves, the storms, all seemed to conspire together to trap him, holding him prisoner within his own devotion. The lighthouse was not merely a place of work, it was a stage set for a tragedy, where the sea, the storm, and the man who kept the flame would all play their roles in a story that would outlast flesh and bone. And so, by the edge of the world where waves never ceased their assault, and winds never lost their voice, a keeper stood watch. His tower was both fortress and coffin, both beacon and curse. And it was here, in this brutal and lonely place, that he began the journey into legend, the journey of the man who would never leave. Every legend begins with an ordinary life. The man who would one day be bound to his tower was not born a ghost, nor did he emerge from the sea fully formed in darkness. He was once flesh and blood, a child of the coast, a man molded by hardship and shaped by the rhythm of the waves. His story begins not in the lantern room, but in a village where the sea gave life and took it away with equal cruelty. He was the son of a fisherman, raised on tales of drowned fathers and lost brothers. From his earliest days he knew the sea not as a backdrop, but as a predator, an endless force that both sustained and devoured. When storms swept in, he would watch from the shore as the horizon vanished, the ocean turning black and wild. When the storms passed, wreckage often washed ashore, broken masts, splintered hulls, sometimes bodies. He grew up with salt on his skin, with the taste of brine on his lips, and with the knowledge that no one truly escaped the sea. In those days the lighthouse on the rocks was already feared and revered. He would watch its light swing slowly across the waves at night, and sometimes he swore it lingered on him longer than it should, as if choosing him. Children in the village whispered about curses, about keepers who lost their minds or vanished into the sea, but he was not afraid. Instead, he felt drawn to the tower's loneliness, as if it reflected something inside him. When he came of age, he followed his father to sea, but he was no sailor. He was quiet, contemplative, and unyieldingly patient, qualities the others mocked but which ironically made him suited for lighthouse duty. After a storm nearly claimed his father's life and left their family impoverished, he sought work at the tower. To him the choice was clear. The sea could never be trusted, but perhaps one could at least watch over it. At first he was assigned as an assistant keeper. His duties were menial, cleaning lenses, trimming wicks, hauling oil up the endless spiral staircase, yet he performed them with a devotion that unsettled his superiors. Where other assistants grew restless, longing for shore leave, he seemed content within the stone walls. When storms raged, he would remain at his post long after others sought refuge, standing in the lantern room as though daring the sea to break him. His reports were meticulous, his logs filled with precise descriptions of weather, tides, and even the moods of the sea. Inspectors praised him for his discipline, but the villagers whispered that his devotion was unnatural. When he was promoted to head keeper, he embraced the role as though it had been destined. Unlike many, he did not bring a wife or family to live with him in the quarters below. He said the tower was his family, the light his child, and the sea his companion. He spent weeks, then months, without setting foot on the mainland. His requests for supplies grew fewer, as though he had stripped his life down to nothing but the essentials: oil, tools, and solitude. It was during this time that his fixation deepened. He began writing in his logbook with an obsessive hand, filling page after page with not only observations but strange reflections. He described the sea as if it were alive, sometimes angry, sometimes mournful. He wrote of voices carried on the wind, of whispers that came through the stone walls during storms. At first, these were dismissed as the effects of isolation, but soon the writings turned darker. He spoke of the light itself as though it had consciousness, demanding his service, punishing him if he faltered. Neighbors on the mainland noticed changes when he did come ashore. He walked with a distant gaze, speaking little, his words clipped and hollow. Some said his eyes reflected the lantern, as though he carried its light inside him. Children avoided him, muttering that he smelled of salt and oil, like a man not entirely of this world. Even those who respected him grew uneasy. They said he had stopped belonging to the village, and belonged instead to the tower, and yet he remained diligent. Ships reported the beam burning steady, even in the worst storms. Sailors blessed his name when they passed safely by the treacherous rocks. To them he was a guardian, a silent protector watching through the fog. But to the villagers, he was becoming something else, a figure consumed by the very duty meant to preserve life. The turning point came when his scheduled departure approached. Every keeper knew their service had limits, for no man could endure the tower forever. His replacement had been selected, and the day arrived when he should have packed his belongings, extinguished the lantern for the last time, and descended the spiral staircase as a free man. Yet he did not leave. The supply crew that arrived found him still at his post, the lantern burning bright, his logbook freshly filled. When told it was time to go, he shook his head. The sea, he said, was not finished with him. The light could not be left untended. The tower, he whispered, had not released him. The men laughed nervously, assuming fatigue had clouded his mind. But when they returned weeks later, he was still there, unchanged, his eyes hollow but his devotion unbroken. Months turned into years. No replacement ever took over. Official records show confusion. Letters sent, reassignment orders ignored, inspectors baffled by his refusal. But the truth was simple. He had made his choice. He would not leave. The oath he had taken as a young man had grown into chains, and he wore them willingly. To him, abandoning the light was death itself. The villagers began to weave stories around his refusal. Some said he had struck a bargain with the sea, that as long as he kept the light, the waves would not swallow their fishing boats. Others whispered that he had already died, and that what walked the tower was not a man but his restless soul. Children grew up hearing his name spoken like a warning, a reminder of what happens when duty becomes obsession, and so the keeper who would not leave became legend. He was no longer merely a man at his post. He was a shadow pacing the lantern room, a figure bound to stone and flame, a presence that refused release. Where other keepers came and went, his watch endured. Where others were replaced, he remained. The tower and the man had fused into one. From that moment forward, the line between his life and his legend blurred. Was he still alive, or had he already become something else? No one could say. What was certain was this: the tower no longer stood alone, for within its walls lived a keeper who had vowed never to abandon his post, and who, true to his word, never did. To live in a lighthouse was to live with silence, not the peaceful silence of a countryside meadow, nor the gentle quiet of a chapel, but a suffocating, unending stillness that wrapped itself around the mind like a vice. The sea roared outside, yes, but that roar was constant, an eternal backdrop that became as invisible as one's own breath. The silence that haunted the keeper's tower was of a different kind, the silence of no human voices, no footsteps but your own, no laughter, no warmth. It was in this silence that madness grew. For the keeper who never left, solitude was not merely an inconvenience, it was his entire existence. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. Seasons came and went, but within the stone walls the world seemed frozen in a single eternal moment. His only companions were the endless cycle of the lantern above and the endless fury of the sea below. He awoke to its sound, he ate with it, he slept with it, until the very rhythm of waves became stitched into his heartbeat. At first his logbooks showed the discipline expected of a keeper. Weather observations, wind directions, notes on passing ships, all carefully recorded. But over time, his entries began to shift. Practical notes gave way to long, rambling passages that read less like reports and more like confessions. He described hearing voices in the wind, whispers that threaded through the howl of the storm. He wrote of footsteps echoing on the staircase when he was alone, of doors that seemed to rattle as if someone pressed against them from the other side. His words grew stranger still. He began to write of the sea not as an element, but as a personality, a being with moods and demands. "The sea is watching me tonight," one entry read. "It waits at the door, restless. I trimmed the wick twice, but it is not satisfied." Another noted, "I heard it call my name in the fog. Not in my ears, but inside my bones. If I ignore it, will it grow angry?" The villagers whispered of these writings, though few ever saw them. When supply crews visited, they found him gaunt, his skin pale, his eyes dark hollows. He greeted them politely, but his words often drifted into riddles. He would ask them if they too had heard the sea speak. When they laughed nervously, he would smile faintly and whisper, "Then you are lucky." Loneliness was the obvious culprit. Psychologists today speak of isolation psychosis, a condition documented in explorers, prisoners and soldiers cut off from human contact. The symptoms were all there: hallucinations, paranoia, an inability to separate dream from waking life. But the villagers were not doctors, and even if they had been, they would have struggled to explain the otherworldly quality of his decline. This was not the madness of a man losing touch with reality. It was the madness of a man who had found another reality and could not return. It is said that during storms, he performed strange rituals in the lantern room. Witnesses from passing ships claimed they saw him moving in circles, hands lifted as though in prayer, the light flickering oddly, as though in response. Some believed he was pleading with the sea to spare the ships. Others whispered that he was summoning the storm itself, offering it lives in exchange for his own survival. One fisherman swore that he saw the keeper standing on the gallery during a hurricane, arms outstretched, shouting words the wind seemed to carry out over the waves like a curse. Inside the tower, objects began to move without explanation. Tools shifted places, oil cans toppled, though no hand touched them. Lanterns swayed in airless rooms. He recorded these events with obsessive precision, as if cataloguing the haunting of his own mind. The sea entered the walls tonight. It tapped the stones like fingers. It walked the staircase. It stood behind me while I trimmed the wick. His entries no longer distinguished between hallucination and reality. To him they had become one and the same. Visitors who dared spend a night in the tower left unsettled. One inspector wrote that the atmosphere was like being inside a coffin that breathed. Another described a sensation of pressure in the air, as if the ocean itself pressed inward against the walls. No one stayed long, but the keeper endured, day after day, year after year, until what remained of his humanity seemed to dissolve into the stone. And yet, there was devotion in his madness. He never failed to tend the light. Even as his writings spiraled into incoherence, the lantern never faltered. Sailors continued to pass safely by, seeing the steady flash of the beam in fog and storm. To them, the keeper remained a guardian. To himself, he had become something far darker, a warden, a prisoner, and perhaps even a servant of the sea that tormented him. The villagers began to avoid speaking his name. They said to do so was to draw his gaze, or worse, the gaze of the thing that had claimed him. When asked why he had not left, why he refused to surrender the tower, the only answer ever recorded was chilling in its simplicity: "Because it will not let me." Whether he meant the sea, the lighthouse, or something unseen, no one dared to ask again. This was no longer the story of a man performing his duty. It had become the story of a man undone by it. His solitude had birthed visions, his devotion had given them power, and his refusal to leave had bound him to a darkness that lived both inside and outside the tower. Isolation had not merely driven him to madness, it had transformed him into something the villagers could no longer recognize as human. And so, the line blurred. Was he a man still tending his flame in defiance of despair? Or was he already a ghost, pacing the gallery in endless vigil, lost to the silence that consumed him? For those who looked upon the tower at night, seeing his shadow move against the lantern's glow, there was no answer, only unease. The keeper remained, but the man was gone. What endured was something else, something bound to stone and storm, something that would never leave. Every keeper knows the day will come when his watch ends. It is part of the unspoken rhythm of the service, years of isolation, years of tending the flame, and then, eventually, the moment of release. For some, it comes as a relief, a long-awaited return to family and society. For others, it comes with reluctance, a farewell to the tower that had become both home and prison. But for the keeper at the heart of this tale, that day arrived, like a verdict he refused to accept. The record is clear enough. His term was up. His replacement had been selected and assigned. Supplies had been arranged for the transition, and a small crew was dispatched to bring him back to the mainland. By all accounts, it should have been a simple departure, a keeper walking down the spiral staircase for the final time, the lantern extinguished under his watch, the keys handed over to another. But simplicity was not the fate of this man, nor of his tower. The morning of his release was stormless, yet heavy with omen. The sea lay flat and dark, like a mirror hiding secrets beneath. Fog rolled low across the water, swallowing the horizon. When the supply boat approached, its crew spotted the familiar silhouette in the lantern room, the keeper pacing, as always, his shadow drifting back and forth against the glow of the flame. He had lit the lamp the night before, though he knew it would be his last. The villagers said later that this act alone revealed his intentions. He had no plan to surrender the light. When the men reached the landing, they found him waiting at the base of the tower. His face was drawn, pale, his beard ragged, but his posture unshaken. He greeted them with politeness, as though nothing were unusual. They informed him that his relief had arrived, that his service was ended, that it was time to go. He listened. He nodded. And then he simply said, "No." At first, they thought he was jesting, or perhaps reluctant in the way of all men who have grown accustomed to routine. They tried to persuade him, speaking of rest, of family, of the life waiting for him beyond the rocks, but his expression never changed. He repeated himself, calmly, firmly, with a weight that chilled their blood. "No, the tower still needs me. The sea still waits. I cannot leave." The replacement keeper, unnerved, insisted on entering the tower. Yet when he climbed the stairs to the lantern room, he found it strangely unwelcoming. The air felt heavy, the silence oppressive. He reported later that the flame itself seemed brighter than usual, its glass lens glimmering as though it were alive. He could not shake the feeling of being watched, not by the man below, but by the tower itself. He descended quickly, pale and shaken, and refused to press the matter further. The crew, unsure how to proceed, left him supplies and promised to return. Perhaps they hoped the solitude would break him, that another few weeks alone would weaken his resolve. But when they came back, nothing had changed. The lantern still burned, the shadow still paced, the keeper still refused to abandon his post. Weeks turned into months, months into years. Official letters demanded his return, but he ignored them. Inspectors arrived, but he barred them from entering, claiming the tower belonged to him now. The replacement keeper resigned, unwilling to contest the post, and slowly, quietly, the authorities gave up. The lighthouse functioned, the flame never faltered, and ships continued to pass safely by. In the end, What mattered more than obedience was results, and so his refusal was overlooked. But the villagers did not forget. To them, his refusal was no act of stubbornness, but a pact. They said the sea had spoken to him, and that he had answered. They whispered that if he left, the waves would rise and devour the coast. Others believed the opposite, that by refusing to leave, he had angered the sea, and that the storms to come would claim their vengeance. One story tells of a night when a violent storm struck the coast. Ships were wrecked, and bodies washed ashore, but the lighthouse remained untouched. From the mainland, witnesses claimed they saw him standing on the gallery, arms raised to the heavens, as if commanding the tempest itself. The light burned brighter than ever, its beams slicing through the storm like a blade. Some swore it was not oil fueling the lamp that night, but something else, something darker, drawn from the keeper's very soul. The day he should have left became the day he never did. From that point onward, his life ceased to follow the path of ordinary men. He was no longer bound by schedules, rotations, or human expectations. He belonged to the tower. His refusal was not merely an act of defiance, it was the moment of transformation, the point at which man and legend fused. And so, the keeper's fate diverged from the rest, where others moved on to new posts, new lives or peaceful retirements. He remained. Where others returned to their families, he stayed with the sea. Where others extinguished their lights for the last time, his flame burned without end. The supply crews would still come, sometimes finding him on the gallery, sometimes glimpsing only his shadow. They brought food, oil, and letters, though he rarely accepted the last. They asked him again, sometimes gently, sometimes sternly, if he was ready to leave, but the answer never changed. He belonged to the tower. This was the moment his humanity began to fade in the eyes of others. To the authorities, he was a keeper who had overstayed. To the villagers, he was a warden chained by forces unseen. To the sailors passing by, he was a figure of reassurance, a man whose devotion ensured their survival. But to himself, he had already crossed a threshold. He could no longer leave, for leaving meant breaking the covenant, and so, the day he should have left became the day he was bound forever. A day remembered not for departure, but for the refusal that sealed his fate. The keeper stayed, and in doing so, he stepped out of the realm of ordinary men, and into the realm of myth. The tower had claimed him, and he had claimed the tower. Neither would ever let the other go. When the keeper refused to leave, the villagers said something shifted. It was as though the sea itself took notice of his defiance, and the winds, once indifferent, turned their fury upon the coast. What followed were years remembered not for calm waters or safe journeys, but for wreckage, death, and whispers of a curse born within the stone walls of the tower. The first shipwreck came only weeks after his fateful refusal. It was a merchant vessel, strong and well-manned, carrying cargo from across the sea. The night was calm when it sailed into the waters near the lighthouse, yet by morning, the coastline was littered with debris, crates cracked open like coffins, splintered planks, and the bodies of sailors tangled in seaweed. Survivors were few, and their testimonies were strange. They claimed the light had vanished at the very moment they needed it most, swallowed by the fog. But others insisted they had seen the lantern blazing clear, and a figure standing in the gallery, unmoving, watching as their ship was torn apart on the rocks. The stories spread quickly. Sailors began to dread passing that stretch of coast. They spoke of the light flickering strangely, of its rhythm faltering, as though someone, or something, was manipulating it. Some said the keeper guided them deliberately toward the rocks, not away. Others believed the sea itself had twisted the beam, turning salvation into a lure. Whatever the cause, the wrecks continued. One winter, 3 ships went down in a single storm. Entire crews were lost. The waves hurled timber and corpses against the cliffs, so many that the villagers stopped counting. That night, witnesses swore the lighthouse beam never faltered. In fact, it burned brighter than ever, too bright, as if mocking the drowned with a cruel, unwavering gaze. One fisherman who survived claimed that in the midst of the storm, he looked up at the lantern room and saw 2 lights, the great Fresnel lens, and another smaller glow beside it, like a man's eyes staring down at him. The villagers began to call it the Cursed Tower. They avoided speaking of it directly, referring instead to the place of wrecks, or the Watcher's Stone. Families who had lost men to the sea whispered that the keeper had struck a bargain, that he offered lives to the waves in exchange for his own eternal place in the tower. Mothers told their children not to wander the cliffs at night, lest the keeper's shadow beckon them into the surf. Even supply crews grew fearful. Many refused to dock unless the weather was calm. They claimed the sea grew restless near the rocks, as if unseen hands stirred beneath the surface. On more than one occasion, boats capsized without warning, though no storm had yet risen. Survivors told of sudden currents dragging them toward the rocks, of waves rising like walls to dash them against stone. Always when they looked up, they swore they saw him watching, his figure dark against the lantern glow, never moving, never helping. The strange pattern of wrecks could not be ignored. Authorities launched inquiries, suspecting negligence. Inspectors arrived, questioning the keeper, examining the tower. But every time they came, the light was immaculate, the glass shone, the wick was trimmed, the records precise. His logbooks, though increasingly filled with cryptic passages, contained no evidence of failure. Technically, he had fulfilled his oath, yet the sea continued to claim lives. Some officials blamed storms, fog, or faulty navigation. Others began to whisper in private that the man had lost his mind, and that his obsession with the light had crossed into something dangerous. But no matter how many letters were written, or how many officials debated, the keeper remained. The tower functioned, and so the deaths continued. Folklore took over where facts failed. The villagers said the tower itself had become a beacon for death, its stones soaked with the cries of the drowned. They believed the keeper no longer served the living, but the dead, that he tended the flame not for sailors, but for spirits lost to the waves. Each wreck was an offering, each drowned man another soul to join his eternal congregation. Fishermen began to report strange sights, ghostly ships drifting silently through fog, vanishing when approached, figures waving from the rocks, only to dissolve into spray when rescuers drew near. Some even claimed to hear bells tolling from beneath the sea, as though entire sunken churches rang their mourning for the drowned. And always, above it all, the lighthouse burned. One tale passed down for generations tells of a storm so fierce it was said to have screamed like 1,000 widows. A great passenger ship, carrying dozens of families, was driven toward the rocks. The villagers stood helpless on the cliffs, lanterns in hand, watching the doomed vessel crash. Yet one witness swore that before the impact, he saw the lighthouse flame shift, brighten, dim, then flare again, as though manipulated. The ship struck the rocks within seconds. Later, survivors described seeing the keeper on the gallery, raising one arm as if in command, while the storm obeyed. Whether these were illusions of terrified minds or signs of something darker, no one could say. But the wrecks became so numerous, so cruel, that the coast itself gained a reputation as haunted. Maps marked the area with warnings. Sailors crossed themselves when passing, whispering prayers not just for safe passage, but to appease the keeper who never left. And yet, through it all, the man remained at his post. He never faltered in his routines, never acknowledged the rumors. His logbooks continued to record each storm, each wreck, in detail so precise it bordered on the obsessive. But woven between the weather reports were lines that revealed the true state of his mind. The sea demanded more tonight. The rocks are hungry. The light must be fed. To the villagers, these writings were proof of the curse. To the authorities, they were the ramblings of a man driven mad by solitude. To the sailors, they were confirmation of what they already believed. The tower was no longer a beacon of safety. It was a lure, a trap, a place where the sea claimed what it desired, guided by the hand of the keeper who refused to leave. The curse of the tower became legend, a story that outlived those who told it. And still, through fog and storm, the light burned on, watched over by the solitary figure who paced the gallery. To this day, some say his shadow can still be seen in the glow, standing silent as ships pass, deciding, perhaps, who will be spared and who will be claimed by the rocks below. For every life, there is an ending. For every story, a final chapter. Yet for the keeper of the cursed tower, death itself seemed to falter, hesitating at the threshold as though uncertain whether it could truly claim him. The records tell one story, the villagers another, and the sea, always the sea, offers no answer but silence. What remains is a tangle of contradictions, a mystery so dense that even the passing of centuries has failed to unravel it. Officially, his death was noted in sparse and clinical language: deceased, cause unknown, body unrecovered. That was all. A line in a government ledger, filed away with other names, other lives, other forgotten men. To the authorities, it was enough to close the matter. The tower had been automated soon after, its light tended by mechanisms rather than men. The keeper was gone, case closed. But those who lived near the tower, those who watched his shadow pacing year after year, knew better, or at least believed they did. They said no body was ever pulled from the sea, no grave was ever filled with his remains. The records may have declared him dead, but the cliffs and waves told a different story. For nights after his supposed death, the villagers still saw the lantern burning, steady and unbroken, even though no one had been assigned to tend it. Some claimed his final days were marked by violence. One tale insists that during a brutal storm, he was seen on the gallery, clutching the railing as waves smashed against the rocks below. Lightning struck near the tower, illuminating him in brief flashes, arms spread wide, head tilted back, as if he were embracing the storm. When dawn came, he was gone, his logbook ending mid-sentence. The sea, nothing more. Others claimed his end was quieter, almost ritualistic. They said he prepared himself for death like a monk preparing for prayer. He polished the lens until it gleamed like crystal. He trimmed the wick and filled the reservoir with oil, ensuring the light would burn long after he was gone. Then he climbed to the lantern room one final time, lit the flame, and sat in silence. When the supply crew arrived weeks later, they found the light still glowing, but the tower empty. No trace of him remained, no coat, no boots, no body, only the steady flame, turning slowly as though he was still there. A third version, whispered in taverns and fishing huts, suggests something more chilling. According to these accounts, his death never happened at all. He did not drown. He did not vanish. He simply continued. Some villagers swore they saw him walking the cliffs years after his death had been recorded. Others claimed they heard his footsteps echoing inside the empty tower. One family, living on the mainland, told of a figure knocking on their door during a storm, only to disappear when they opened it, leaving behind wet footprints that led nowhere. Perhaps the most unsettling stories came from sailors. Long after the tower was said to be unmanned, ships reported seeing the light burning bright. Some swore they saw a figure pacing inside the lantern room, silhouetted against the glow. In fog, they claimed to hear a voice carried across the waves, warning them to steer clear, or in some cases, urging them toward the rocks. To these sailors, the keeper had never left at all. He remained in the tower, bound by his oath, deathless and tireless, tending a flame that no longer needed fuel. Skeptics, of course, have their explanations. They argue that the sightings were illusions, products of fear and fatigue. The sea is a master of trickery, bending light, warping sound, creating phantoms out of mist. The automation of the tower ensured that the light continued even without a human hand, which could easily explain the reports of its persistence. As for the figure in the lantern room, perhaps it was nothing more than shadows thrown by the rotating lens, and yet, the logbooks complicate matters. After his supposed death, new entries appeared in the margins of the final volumes, entries written in the same cramped, slanted hand that villagers swore was his. Phrases like, "The sea calls again," "It is not finished," "I remain." Officials dismissed these as forgeries, the work of pranksters or later keepers with a taste for melodrama. But to those who had known the man, the handwriting was unmistakable. So what, then, was the truth? Did he drown in the fury of the waves, his body swallowed by the abyss? Did he walk away from the tower, lost to madness, vanishing into fog? Or did he pass beyond the ordinary fate of men, his soul fused with the stone and flame, his vigil eternal? No one can say for certain. What is undeniable is this: his absence did not bring peace. The tower remained restless. The villagers continued to report strange lights, strange sounds, strange shadows. Sailors still swore the beam shifted in unnatural ways, And always, in the corner of their vision, there seemed to be a figure pacing the gallery, as though the keeper was still there, still refusing to leave. Death had claimed his name in the records, but the sea had not released him. His story did not end with a grave or a funeral. It lingered, unresolved, like a storm that never passes, like a flame that refuses to die. The keeper's death, or the absence of it, only deepened the legend. He had defied the living world, and perhaps he had defied death itself, and so the question remains, did the keeper ever die at all? Or is he still there, pacing his endless circle, waiting for the next ship to pass, the next storm to rise, the next soul to join him in the tower by the edge of the world? If death had truly taken the keeper, then the tower never received the message. For those who ventured near in the years that followed, it was as if the lighthouse itself still believed him alive. The lantern continued to glow when no hand was present to light it. Shadows flickered in windows where no flame should burn, and most chilling of all were the reports of a figure moving in the lantern room, pacing the gallery as though carrying out a duty he could never abandon. The earliest accounts came from sailors. These men, hardened by salt and storm, were not easily rattled. Yet time and again their testimonies carried the same unease. In fog, when visibility narrowed to a whisper of light, they claimed the beam sometimes split, one ray steady, the other faltering, like the work of two hands guiding the lens. Some swore they saw a man framed in the glow, standing still and staring outward, though the tower had long since been declared unmanned. One captain, a skeptic to the core, later wrote of a night when he passed dangerously close to the rocks. Through his spyglass, he caught a clear view of the gallery. There, illuminated by lightning, stood a figure with his back to the sea facing the lantern. His arms moved in precise motions, as though trimming a wick or adjusting the lens. The captain dismissed it at first as a hallucination, until his first mate, watching through his own glass, asked in a trembling voice, "Why is the man inside the light and not outside it?" The villagers too were not spared. Some reported that on stormy nights, the tower seemed to breathe. Windows flashed with a glow, even when the lantern was known to be extinguished. Children swore they saw a man walking the cliffs, his silhouette swallowed by fog. A few even claimed he knocked on their doors during gales, asking in a hollow voice for oil to keep the lamp alive. Yet when they opened their doors, there was no one, only wet footprints fading into nothing. Ghost stories grew around these sightings. One tale told of fishermen caught in a sudden squall. They rowed desperately, guided by the lighthouse beam. Just when they thought they would be dashed upon the rocks, a voice carried across the storm, pull left now." They obeyed instinctively, and found themselves in calmer waters, safe. When they looked up to the gallery to give thanks, they saw a man standing with one hand raised, but his features were hidden in shadow. And when they returned to the village to ask about him, they were told no keeper had served there for years. Another story, darker still, spoke of a shipwreck survivor washed ashore. He claimed that as the vessel broke apart, he saw the light vanish. In the chaos, he glimpsed a figure in the lantern room, but instead of tending the lamp, the man was turning it away, shielding the beam with his body. The survivor swore the figure looked directly at him before the waves pulled him under. Though he lived to tell the tale, the rest of his crew did not. To him, the keeper's ghost was not a savior, but a saboteur. By the early 20th century, stories of the phantom had become so persistent that paranormal investigators began to take notice. Mediums, thrill seekers, and later ghost hunters made their way to the cliffs, drawn by the legend of the man who never left. Many brought with them recording devices, cameras or instruments to measure changes in temperature and sound. What they captured remains controversial, but chilling nonetheless. One group reported hearing rhythmic footsteps on the spiral staircase, though no one else was in the tower. The sounds ascended slowly, paused, then descended again. When they followed, they found nothing but the echo of their own breath. Another team set up cameras in the lantern room. On playback, a faint figure appeared in the glass reflection, thin, stooped, hands clasped behind his back as he paced in endless circles. The image dissolved into static within seconds, leaving only the empty lens. But perhaps the most terrifying accounts came from those who stayed overnight. One investigator described waking to the sound of scratching at his door, as though fingernails raked against the wood. Another swore the entire tower vibrated in the middle of the night, as if something massive pounded on its walls from the outside. And nearly all of them reported the same detail, the smell of oil, sharp and acrid, lingering in the air, even when the lantern had not been lit in decades. Skeptics, of course, dismissed these encounters as superstition, illusions born of fear and expectation. They argued that the mind, when primed with stories of ghosts, sees shadows where none exist. The sea, with its shifting lights and eerie sounds, provides fertile ground for hallucination. Yet the consistency of the reports gave even doubters pause. Too many people described the same figure, the same pacing steps, the same hollow presence. The villagers themselves avoided the tower whenever possible. To them, it was not a curiosity to be studied, but a reality to be endured. They knew better than to mock the stories, for they had grown up with the sound of storms rattling their windows and the sight of the lantern burning when it should not. Some said the keeper's ghost was harmless, protecting sailors as he had in life. Others insisted he had grown bitter, vengeful, guiding ships to ruin as penance for his refusal to leave. What united all the tales was this: the lantern room was never empty. Whether seen through a spyglass, glimpsed in lightning, or captured in the corners of photographs, the figure remained. He paced the gallery. He watched the sea. He tended a flame that should no longer exist. To this day, those who pass the coast speak of the light as more than a beacon. It is a haunting, a presence that refuses extinction. The keeper's body may be gone, his name reduced to a line in forgotten ledgers, but his shadow endures, bound to the glass and the storm. The lantern room has become his eternal prison, and his eternal pulpit, and as long as the light burns, the question persists: is it the mechanism that guides ships to safety, or is it the phantom within, keeping a vigil that will never end? A lighthouse is meant to be a place of salvation. It stands as the last hope for men who wander blind across an endless expanse of black water. Yet for the keeper who never left, his tower became something altogether different. A mausoleum built not of marble, but of salt-stained stone, a tomb whose occupant was not buried in the earth but bound within its walls. The villagers came to see the tower not as a beacon of life, but as a shrine to death. Death clung to the place like sea spray. Generations of wrecks littered the rocks at its base, each broken mast and shattered hull a gravestone carved by waves. Sailors whispered that the sea had claimed more lives there than any battlefield. When storms rolled in, they said the cries of the drowned could be heard in the wind, rising above the roar of surf, echoing through the narrow channels in the cliffs. And above it all, the lighthouse stood silent, as if guarding a cemetery no one dared to consecrate. The keeper himself seemed less like a living man, and more like an occupant of this tomb. He paced its galleries, tended its light, and filled its logbooks with confessions that read like epitaphs. His body may have walked, but his soul was already entombed in stone. Villagers spoke of him as if he had already passed, referring to him in the past tense while still glimpsing his shadow at the tower. It was as though he had died long before his physical disappearance, and the lighthouse had absorbed him entirely. Maritime tradition has long been steeped in ritual. Sailors toss coins into the waves before voyages, whisper prayers to the drowned, and avoid whistling on deck for fear of summoning storms. Death at sea is unlike death on land. There is no soil, no coffin, no permanence. Bodies sink into the deep, devoured by the dark, their final resting place unknown. In such a world, a lighthouse becomes more than a guide. It becomes an anchor for restless souls. If men vanish beneath the waves, where else might they cling but the one light that promised salvation and failed to deliver it? The villagers believed this with a conviction born of fear. They said the tower's stones held the weight of every life lost to the rocks below. Each cry, each gasp, each desperate plea was etched into the mortar. The keeper was not alone, they insisted. He shared his tomb with countless others, spirits of sailors, fishermen and passengers who perished within sight of the flame. Their presence explained the phantom knocks on the spiral staircase, the shadows in the lens, the voices that bled into the keeper's logbooks. One old woman told of walking the cliffs at dusk. She swore she heard singing, low, mournful, like a hymn carried by many voices. She followed the sound to the tower, but when she drew close it ceased. Only the lantern glowed, its slow rotation washing over her like the gaze of an unblinking eye. To her the tower was no longer a lighthouse. It was a mass grave, its song a requiem for those swallowed by the sea. And what of the keeper himself? If the lighthouse was a tomb, was he its prisoner, or its priest? Some believed he tended the light not for the living but for the dead, guiding the souls of the drowned as they drifted in eternal darkness. Others believed he had become the dead himself, his watch transformed into a penance that bound him to the gallery forever. In either case he was inseparable from the role. Just as tombs require guardians to protect the sanctity of the dead, so too did this tower have its eternal warden. Legends elsewhere echo this motif. In Scandinavian folklore, drowned sailors become drauga, spirits trapped in half-life, forever bound to the waters that claimed them. In Celtic tales, phantom watchmen keep vigil at ruined towers, unable to abandon their posts even in death. The villagers wove these old stories into the keeper's fate, painting him as both cursed and holy. His refusal to leave his post was no longer a tale of stubbornness. It was a ritual binding, a sacrifice to keep something darker contained within the stones. Ghost hunters who later explored the site often described the oppressive weight of the place. One investigator called it a cathedral of grief. Another noted the uncanny sense of being surrounded, as if hundreds of unseen eyes followed every step. They brought with them cameras, meters, and instruments, but what they carried away were feelings: heaviness in the chest, sudden nausea, tears without cause. To them the tower was not simply haunted, it was saturated, steeped in sorrow so deep it clung to the living. Even the sea seemed to acknowledge the tower's funereal role. Storms broke around it in strange ways, as if pulled toward its rocks with unnatural hunger. Wreckage piled at its base like offerings laid upon an altar. Survivors often reported that their last sight before drowning was not the vast ocean but the glow of the lantern, distant and unreachable, like a false promise leading them to death. And through it all the figure in the lantern room persisted. Whether seen in lightning, fog, or moonlight, he paced his circle, his shadow etched against the flame. Some said he bowed his head like a mourner. Others swore he raised his arms like a priest conducting rites. Whatever the gesture, the message was clear. The tower had become his tomb, and he had accepted his role within it. The lighthouse still stands, battered but unbroken, its lantern automated now, its stairways abandoned. Yet those who visit speak of the same feeling, that they are not entering a structure but a grave. The stones hum with silence, the air hangs heavy, and the light, though mechanical, carries the weight of centuries of death. Visitors leave quickly, whispering prayers as they walk away, for fear that lingering too long might make them part of the tomb as well. The keeper's body may never have been buried, but his soul rests there, or perhaps it does not rest at all. The tower is both coffin and shrine, both prison and pulpit. It is his eternal resting place, and the eternal resting place of countless others claimed by the sea. A lighthouse meant to save lives became instead a graveyard above the waves, and its keeper became the ghost who never left. Every haunting story straddles a thin line between truth and invention. On one side lie the cold facts, logbooks, records, reports written in the neat hand of officials who sought order. On the other side swirls the shifting fog of folklore, carried from mouth to mouth in taverns, fishing huts, and around kitchen tables on stormy nights. The legend of the keeper who never left is a perfect storm of both, a tale whose foundation rests on documented history, but whose walls have been built by whispers, superstition, and fear. Let us begin with what is recorded. Maritime archives confirm that a man did indeed serve longer than any other keeper on that stretch of coast. His logbooks exist, weathered and stained with salt, containing years of precise entries about storms, tides, and passing ships. Inspectors noted his discipline, his unwavering commitment to keeping the light burning. Letters from supply crews confirmed that he refused reassignment, insisting on continuing his service beyond the usual term. These facts are undeniable. There was a keeper, and he would not leave his tower. But beyond that, the records fray. His official death is listed, but the details are vague. No body recovered, no cause confirmed. Just a date and a declaration. The lighthouse was decommissioned not long after, its lantern automated, its staircases left to gather dust. From the perspective of bureaucracy, the matter ended there. Yet stories continued long after the ink dried, stories that contradict the neat finality of the ledger. The folklore paints a far richer and far darker picture. According to the villagers, his logbooks contained more than weather notes. They speak of hidden entries written in a frantic hand where he described voices in the storm, footsteps on the stairs, and conversations with the sea itself. These passages, they claim, were quietly removed before the books were archived, scrubbed from history by officials who feared the embarrassment of publishing evidence of madness. Whether such pages ever truly existed is impossible to prove, but the rumor alone was enough to ignite the imagination. Newspaper clippings from the era offer further contradictions. One article reported a supply crew finding the tower empty, its lanterns still burning, no trace of the keeper. Another, printed only months later, claimed he had drowned in a storm, his body never recovered. Still another insisted he had retired quietly to the mainland and died in obscurity years later. These conflicting accounts suggest either sloppy reporting or deliberate embellishment. Yet for those who wanted to believe, the confusion itself became proof that something stranger was at play. Oral legends added still more layers. Fishermen claimed to see him pacing the gallery long after his supposed death, his silhouette framed against the glow. Families whispered that during storms he knocked on their doors asking for oil, his voice thin and hollow, his footprints vanishing into the night. Some even claimed to hear his pen scratching in the logbook when no one was there, as though the tower itself continued his ritual. None of these accounts can be verified, but their persistence across generations suggests they are rooted in something deeper than invention. Scholars who have studied the legend often argue that isolation and grief birthed the folklore. The coast was a graveyard of sailors. Nearly every family had lost someone to the waves. In such a place, it was easier to believe in curses than coincidence. The lighthouse became a scapegoat, a symbol of loss transformed into a story that could be told and retold. The keeper who refused to leave became an avatar of endurance and despair, embodying both the devotion and the madness of men who lived too long with the sea. Yet others argue that the folklore conceals kernels of truth. Paranormal researchers point to the consistency of sightings, the figure in the lantern room, the steady pacing, the unbroken beam. These details recur across decades, told by sailors from different countries, villagers of different generations, investigators of different eras. How could so many separate accounts describe the same image if it were all invention? Perhaps the keeper truly did linger, not in flesh but in some spectral form bound to the tower. There is also the question of the light itself. Official records state that after automation, the lantern was controlled by machinery. Yet multiple witnesses swore that its behavior remained uncanny. It flickered when no storm was present. It burned too brightly in fog, as if pushing against the very mist. It dimmed at moments when ships approached, only to flare again after they struck the rocks. Mechanisms can malfunction, yes, but the timing seemed almost intentional. Was it the fault of aging equipment, or the unseen hand of the keeper still tending his post? What makes the legend so enduring is not whether the facts support it, but how the facts fail to fully dismiss it. Bureaucracy offers only silence where the villagers demanded answers. Logbooks tell of storms but not of voices. Newspapers contradict themselves. Oral traditions exaggerate, but they preserve something official history cannot: the raw fear of those who lived in the shadow of the tower. The truth perhaps lies somewhere in between. Maybe he was a man who refused to surrender his post, whose obsession became the seed of myth. Maybe he did die quietly in a storm or from exhaustion, and the rest was shaped by grief and imagination. Or maybe, just maybe, the villagers were right. Maybe the sea claimed him but the tower refused to let him go. For those who pass the coast today, fact and folklore blur seamlessly. The lighthouse stands abandoned, its staircases crumbling, its lantern automated. Yet visitors swear they feel watched, that the air carries whispers, that shadows shift just beyond sight. Tourists read plaques that recount the official story, but locals still lower their voices when asked about the keeper. They do not speak his name easily, as though afraid he might hear. In the end, the question is not which version is true, but why the legend persists. Perhaps it is because the story touches something fundamental: the fear of being forgotten, the terror of isolation, the seduction of obsession. The keeper who never left embodies the possibility that devotion can outlive death, that duty can imprison the soul, that even in a world of facts and records some truths remain untouchable, preserved in whispers carried by the sea. And so the lighthouse endures, half in history, half in legend. Its stones hold the weight of facts, its shadows hold the breath of folklore, and in the lantern room where a light still burns, sailors swear they see a figure pacing, blurring the line between what was and what still may be. Time is a merciless tide. Empires collapse, ships rot into sand, and even the strongest towers are worn thin by salt and storm. Yet the lighthouse at the edge of the world still stands. Its weather-beaten stones are testament to stubborn endurance. Though its lantern has long been automated, the structure remains intact, its windows staring blankly out to sea like the sockets of a skull. It is no longer a place of duty, but of legend. Still, those who approach it say the keeper never left, that even now the tower watches. Modern visitors describe the place with unease. To reach it, one must brave a treacherous path across jagged cliffs, where winds howl and gulls scream overhead. The closer one comes, the heavier the air feels, as if the tower itself exerts a pressure, a gravity of sorrow. Photographs show a building in decay: rusted railings, cracked glass, stone walls stained black by centuries of storms. Yet no matter how ruined the structure appears, the lantern continues its slow rotation, sweeping its beam across the water like an unblinking eye. Tourists, drawn by morbid curiosity, speak of sensations difficult to explain. Some report sudden chills as they climb the spiral staircase, their breath frosting even on mild days. Others swear they hear footsteps above them, steady and deliberate, pacing in rhythm with their own. A few leave in panic, claiming to hear whispered words carried on the wind, fragments of sentences in a voice dry and hollow. It must burn. It must burn. Ghost hunters have made the site a pilgrimage. Armed with cameras, recorders and electromagnetic meters, they search for proof of the keeper's eternal vigil. Many emerge with unsettling evidence. Audio recorders capture faint scratching noises, like pen on paper, even in empty rooms. Some have caught distant knocks, 3 at a time, echoing from the stairwell. One group recorded a voice saying, "Turn the light," a command spoken in a whisper so faint it was almost missed. The most famous photograph, published online and debated endlessly, shows a translucent figure reflected in the lantern glass, head bowed, hands clasped behind its back in the posture the keeper was known for. Skeptics argue these are illusions, tricks of wind and light amplified by expectation. They point out that the power of suggestion is strong. Enter a place steeped in ghost stories, and you will find ghosts whether they are there or not. But even skeptics admit the tower feels different. One journalist, who prided himself on debunking local legends, spent a night inside as a test. He wrote later that he had never felt such oppressive silence, as though the air itself resisted his presence. He left before dawn, shaken, confessing that while he did not believe in ghosts, he believed in that lighthouse's power to break the human spirit. Locals still avoid it. The older generation refuses to speak of the keeper directly, referring to him only as the watcher. Fishermen give the rocks wide berth, muttering prayers as they sail past. Children dare one another to climb the cliffs and touch the lighthouse door, but rarely does anyone stay long. Those who linger say they feel their names whispered back to them on the wind, as if the tower recognizes each intruder and adds them to a ledger only it keeps. The reputation of the lighthouse has spread far beyond the village. Documentaries feature it in countdowns of haunted places, paranormal forums discuss it with reverence, and travel blogs warn thrill-seekers to enter at their own risk. Some call it a maritime Pompeii, frozen in time, its stones preserving not ash but despair. Others call it a liminal place, where the boundary between the living and the dead thins until one is indistinguishable from the other. Even now, ships passing the coast report strange phenomena. Mariners say the light sometimes falters, dimming for seconds before flaring with unnatural brightness. Radar equipment has been known to fail near the rocks. Some crews insist they hear bells tolling faintly over the water, though no church stands within miles. And always there are the sightings, a figure in the gallery, pacing, watching, never still. These reports come not from tourists or thrill-seekers, but from working sailors with nothing to gain from such tales. Their stories keep the legend alive, passed from deck to deck, reminding all who sail near that the keeper still tends his flame. The tower has also become a place of pilgrimage for those who lost loved ones to the sea. Families leave offerings at its base, flowers, coins, letters sealed in jars. They treat it as both shrine and cemetery, a place where the lost might hear their names spoken. Some even claim that after leaving such offerings, they dream of their departed, dreams vivid and comforting, where the drowned appear dry and smiling, standing beside a light that never goes out. To these mourners the keeper is not a monster, but a guardian of souls guiding their loved ones in the dark. Yet the darker interpretation persists. Legends insist the keeper grows restless, that he resents the automation of his lantern, that he longs for offerings of oil and flame. Some believe he hungers still, that each shipwreck in nearby waters feeds his vigil. There are stories of tourists vanishing on the cliffs, their belongings found but their bodies never recovered. Locals whisper that the tower takes them, adding their souls to the congregation trapped within. Whether coincidence or curse, these disappearances deepen the aura of dread. The tower today is more than stone and glass. It is a presence, a story that refuses to die. It is visited by the curious, feared by the locals, and revered by those who sense in it something eternal. To step inside is to step into history, myth, and nightmare all at once. The walls hum with echoes, the stairwell creaks with invisible weight, and the lantern, though mechanical, seems alive. And always there is the sense of being watched. Travelers describe it with trembling certainty. The moment you look up at the lantern, you see him, sometimes only a shadow, sometimes clearer, but always there pacing, keeping his vow, never leaving. The keeper remains, and the tower remains with him, an eye that never closes on the edge of the world. The sea does not remember names. It swallows ships and men alike, carrying them into its endless depths, leaving only fragments behind, a broken mast, a floating boot, a widow's cry carried on the wind. Yet some stories defy the sea's hunger. They linger, clinging to the shore like seaweed, refusing to wash away. The tale of the lighthouse keeper who never left is one such story, a legend that has become as immortal as the waves themselves. Stand on the cliffs at dusk, when the horizon bleeds red into black, and you will understand why his vigil endures. The tower rises against the dying light, its stones scarred by centuries of storms, its windows staring out to sea like empty sockets. And then the lantern stirs, its beams sweeping across the waters, turning in its eternal rhythm. It is a light no longer needed, for satellites and radar have replaced it, yet it persists, a remnant of another age. Some say this is proof of progress. Others whisper it is proof that the keeper still tends his flame. Legends always ask questions of those who listen. This one asks perhaps the most haunting: when does duty end, and when does obsession begin? The keeper swore an oath, as all men of his calling did. He promised to keep the flame alive, to guard the coast, to save lives. For most it was a burden carried for a time, then set aside, but for him the oath became a chain. It bound him not just to the lantern, but to the tower itself, until even death could not unfasten the links. Was it devotion, or was it madness? Did he remain out of love for the light, or because he could no longer remember how to live without it? Perhaps that is what makes his tale so unsettling. It is not merely a ghost story, it is a mirror. We see in him the danger of devotion that consumes, of duty that erases identity, of a man who gave himself so fully to his work that he ceased to exist beyond it. He became the lighthouse, and the lighthouse became him. Together they remain, a man without death, a tower without rest. For sailors the legend is a reminder of the thin line between salvation and destruction. A light in the night sky can mean safety, or it can mean a trap. They pray when passing the cursed coast, unsure whether the keeper's ghost guides or condemns them. His vigil is not one of comfort, but of uncertainty, an eternal question shimmering on the horizon. Is the light for you, or against you? For villagers, the story is a warning whispered to children. Do not lose yourself to the sea. Do not give yourself wholly to the storm. Do not forget that you are mortal. They speak of the keeper with both reverence and fear, as though he were a saint and a spectre combined. To them he is a lesson. There are promises that must not be kept too long, devotions that can twist into chains, and for those who seek the paranormal, his legend is a beacon in itself. Ghost hunters, thrill seekers and wanderers come to the tower hoping to glimpse him, to hear his footsteps, to feel his presence. Some leave with photographs or recordings, most leave only with unease, but all of them carry away the same impression, the sense that the lighthouse is not empty, that the keeper is still there, pacing in endless circles, tending a flame that no storm can extinguish. What does it mean for a man to never leave? In the world of folklore, it means he has transcended flesh and bone, stepping into the realm of myth. In the world of history, it means his name has been erased, his identity consumed by the legend. In the world of the supernatural, it means his soul is still bound, restless, unable, or unwilling to depart. Each interpretation tells us as much about ourselves as it does about him. The image endures, a solitary figure in the lantern room framed against the glow, walking in endless rhythm as the beam sweeps the waves. He does not speak. He does not rest. He only watches, his eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for ships that may never come. The sea claimed his body perhaps, but not his presence. He remains where he always was, half man, half myth, wholly bound to the light. And so the vigil continues. The tower by the edge of the world still stands, still watching, still waiting. Its stones hum with silence, its stairwell echoes with unseen footsteps, its lantern burns with a glow too steady to be mere machinery. The keeper never left, and perhaps he never will. His story is etched into the salt and wind, carried in the whispers of sailors and the fears of villagers, written not in ink but in the unending crash of waves. As you walk away from the cliffs, you may find yourself glancing back. You may see the light flicker strangely, or swear you glimpse a shadow pacing the gallery. And in that moment, you will understand the truth. Some stories do not end, because some vows cannot be broken. The keeper remains. The tower remains. And the sea, eternal and merciless, keeps their secret. The light still burns. But whether it shines for the living or for the dead, only the watcher in the lantern room knows.